Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with Behind the Lines, the Civil War Monitor's video interview series. And I'm joined today by director Ric Burns. And Ric's new work is Death in the Civil War, How the Unthinkable Became Unforgettable, a new PBS documentary. Ric, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dave, for having me. Appreciate it so much.
So Ric, why don't you start us off a little bit with just telling us about the film in general here.
You know, my brother Ken and I worked on a series which he directed 20 years ago and more called The Civil War. And I got a call about 3 years ago from the executive producer of American Experience, a series on public television, who had read a really remarkable book. And he thought it was a film that I should make. It's called This Republic of Suffering by Drew Faust, who is a remarkable historian, the president of Harvard right now. But in her real time, she is really one of our most distinguished historians. And she'd managed to do something which is quite amazing, given the fact that there's 60,000 plus books published to date on the Civil War, which is to take something that was kind of hiding in plain sight, something that's really obvious about the war is about death, and make us understand that we hadn't really grasped it in its full dimensions. And I was enormously pleased to be asked to make the movie. And I could see why I was asked to. First of all, it saved public television a huge amount of money in research time since I'd already been around the block. But more than that, I think what Mark understood was that, the Civil War is so magnetic as an event. Every aspect of it pulls all of us into it. And I think it really helped that I not only knew the material in a basic way as a one-time student of the war, but that I wasn't going to get seduced into all the other extraordinary things about it, the generals, the battles, the Lees and the Grants, the diplomacy, the technology, that it was really, this is a different story. It's a story of the Civil War that has to do with how 31 million people, i.e. those people living in America, in 4 years underwent a kind of Holocaust, which I think is the right word to use when 2.5–3% of your population dies in a war. A rate of death that if we had a comparable rate of death in a war today, it's some 10 times the number of Americans, 300 million, we would have 7 million dead Americans in 4 years. So how would we feel as a country, how would we feel as Americans, as individuals, if we underwent a bloodbath in which so many of our own had been killed? And that was Drew's starting point, and I think it's an extraordinarily profound starting point to start from. It doesn't ignore the causes and the effects, and it tries to grasp the war. But to say, if you were living in America in those 4 years, the defining experience was that someone you knew, someone you loved, or you yourself, was going to die. And no one escaped it. 1 in 3 Southern men of military age died during the war. 1 in 3. Maybe it's 1 in 5, but even so, somewhere in there. There's an extraordinary statistic. 1 in 10 Union soldiers died. How do people deal with that? And not only that, the rate of death was completely unprecedented. No one could imagine a war having that kind of casualties of wounded or dead. Nothing like it in American history certainly suggested that a war could conceivably kill that many people, that armies would have that many dead people to attend to bury. You would have to find some way of notifying next of kin. And none of the instruments for doing any of those things was in place when the war began. There was no organized systematic burial. There was no federal cemetery. Each battle was fought, and then the aftermath was taken care of on an ad hoc basis, sort of made up in real time by officers who typically didn't have the time or the resources to do much about it. People were buried in mass graves. People were buried and misidentified. There was no system the government undertook to notify next of kin. So newspapers like Harper's Weekly or the New York Tribune gleaned what they could from military reports and publish often wildly erroneous records of the dead in newspapers, and that's how you found out. It was not like an officer saying, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, we regret to inform you. There was no such bureaucracy in place. So basically, you scanned your local newspaper and hoped against hope you didn't see Johnny's name. And if you did, and it said wounded, he might be dead. And if you didn't see his name, he might be dead anyway. He could be listed as dead and be alive. So you have a country, a society, a military, north and south, as well as 31 million people who are literally thrown into the deep end with no expedient for dealing with this kind of experience. That's the story. That's the story that's both kind of staring us in the face about the Civil War, but one that no one has really, to my knowledge, gone into in quite as fine-grained and empathetic a way as Drew Faust. So I was thrilled to be invited into it, and I found it, I think particularly because Ken and I had worked on the Civil War, I found it, revisiting this material, haunting and startling and startlingly fresh. It was as if I was seeing these events, these battles, in a whole new way.
And I wonder if you could speak just a little bit from almost a filmmaker's perspective, really. Obviously, being based off of a book, what kind of benefits do you glean from something like that? Do you feel restricted in some sense? And if you could also, to add further to that, just talk a little bit about your relationship with Drew Faust with this work, because she figures prominently in it herself.
You know, the challenge, the opportunity and the challenge was to take a book that's not on the surface a narrative. And Drew's chapters in this book, chapter 1, dying, chapter 2, killing, chapter 3, burying, and so it goes. And anywhere in any of these chapters, you could be in anywhere during the 4 years of the war or before it or after it, as she roams very widely. So our challenge was to take a non-narrative book, at least non-narrative on the surface, and find the deep story that's within it. And that deep story is a story, and it's there to be found, of a nation really utterly transformed by what Drew calls not just the experience of death, but the work of death. How do you as you're almost inevitably a Christian American soldier, a citizen, civilian, not a professional soldier, how do you die a good death? Profoundly important to religious Americans in the middle 19th century. How do you die a good death where your friends and family and the people who love you can see you're at peace with yourself? How does that happen when you've been blown to pieces on a battlefield with no family near you and no mechanism that the military has for saying, yes, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, your son died at peace. We were there. The Army was taking care of him. So what we wanted to do was go and find the human core of this experience, which was a journey, a cataclysmic journey, for Americans individually and collectively and finally at the national level, and find the inner narrative that took us through the war. And Drew was really our guide every step of the way. She's a remarkable person. Extraordinary powers of empathy for North, South, white, black, men, women, young, old. And I think that empathy for what the human experience was. Without forgetting that there are causes and effects, there are consequences, there are major things at stake: emancipation, union, the survival of the republic, advancing what Lincoln would call in 1863, the new birth of freedom that was taking place in the country, ironically out of such a morass of death. But at the same time, she wanted to make sure that as we felt those causes, those effects, those larger contexts, we never lost sight of a real feeling for what it was like to be on the ground when, at the end of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, you knew your son was with the 2nd Massachusetts, but you had no idea whether he came out alive, dead, or wounded, and you might never find out. He just didn't come home. So what was it like not only to lose husbands, sons, brothers, fathers, but what was like to have them, in a sense, consigned to oblivion, where you don't know what happened? So as David Blight, the extraordinary historian from Yale, who's in our film as well, put it, this is death without a story, death without a narrative attached to it, death without any understanding of what the circumstances were. And that's death which compounds exponentially the grief experienced by those people who suffer and who survive the death. So at so many different levels, she was onto something so elemental about this experience, and had such a warm, empathic way, both in her book but also on camera as well, of really speaking about it. I mean, for example, it was she who, for all we had learned about the Battle of Gettysburg during our Civil War series in this production, what we had never come to understand was that here were 2,400 people in south central Pennsylvania. 150,000 men have just fought for 3 days. They've left behind about a third that number of casualties and 22,000 dead men. They have to somehow, a town of 2,400 and a staggered military, Army of the Potomac, has to figure out what they're going to do with them. How do you deal with 10 times your own population? That this is a population of dead people. And as Drew was the first to point out to me, months and months after the battle, the stench and miasma of rotting human flesh and horse flesh from the fields of Gettysburg was still palpable south of the town, such that the citizens of Gettysburg had to smear their lips with peppermint oil to be able to bear the stench. And as Drew put it, it's one of the simplest questions and the most heartfelt questions I've ever heard anybody ask about the American Civil War. Drew said, how could you go through that experience and not be transformed? And sure enough, you have, in a sense, at the center of this story, and certainly we placed it at the center of this story, the story of Gettysburg. Not the battle itself, but how the men and women of Gettysburg and the Army of the Potomac struggled to deal with the aftermath, which leads you straight to the Gettysburg Address. And there you discover here the most famous, the greatest piece of political poetry, I think arguably the greatest piece of poetry any American has ever written. The Gettysburg Address is delivered at this brand new thing. There's never been a national cemetery before, but now here we have a national cemetery in which all the states who had soldiers who fought in the battle have contributed, civilians have contributed, lawyers in Gettysburg have bought up the ground, the federal government has acquired it. It's been laid out in this brand new way for a cemetery. It's democratic rows radiating out symmetrically around the central focus of it. No officer gets a bigger monument than the private who died as well. Everybody's name, everybody's date. And there's the President of the United States saying a few words. And what's he saying? He's saying, from these honored dead, we must take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And when he says, from these honored dead, this is not an abstraction. There are open graves, there are stacks of coffins with bodies of them, which he can gesture to. So his audience knows he means these men, right here. And that sense that it was a moral choice and a crossroads that the country was facing. That the only way, the only narrative that would make sense and meaning out of this was devotion to that cause. And also, and this is I think what Drew is so profound in understanding, it's a seismic shift in American life. Now the government is saying, if we're asking hundreds of thousands of civilians, of citizens, not professional soldiers, to fight and possibly die in a war that's increasingly now defined as a war about the meaning of citizenship. We, the government, we the people, have a profound obligation, which we have never felt in return. In no previous American war, from the Revolution to the Mexican War of 1846 to 48, had the government ever assumed it had the obligation, moral or otherwise, to stand up to the plate with this one. We must honor their dead. We must bury them with ceremony and honor and respect. We must notify their next of kin. And we must say, these men shall not have died in vain. We will never forget. And hence Lincoln's words. But in a larger sense, we cannot consecrate, we cannot dedicate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men who struggled here have hallowed it far above our poor power to add or detract. That what they did will speak forever as long as we're have the wit to hear it. Those deeds are a clarion call to a shift in government. In some sense, part of Drew's argument is a version of the New Deal began on the fields of Gettysburg. The idea of an enlarged set of responsibilities that the nation has. That things that used to be left to family, to clubs, to parishes, to extended kin, now are going to be taken up by a federal government that knows it's alive as a direct consequence of those stacks of coffins by those graves.
I wonder, your message that you're hoping to impart on your viewers. We live in a society now, we are in a nation at war, yet it's a very distant war. It is not an intimate war that we are encountering on a day-to-day basis. You might see something on the news, you might see something online, but unless you're, have somebody you know personally in a war, you have very little intimate relations with it. What type of message are you trying to get to the Americans of the 21st century and comparing it almost to the experience of the 19th century?
You know, I think the message that we hope to convey was captured by things that people like Mark Shantz, a wonderful historian who appears in our film, said, which is that our mortality, our bodies, are the only thing we really own. Those are our things. Everything else, we could be alienated from everything, but those are the things we own. So what does a republic, perhaps especially a democratic republic, owe, as Mark puts it in our film, to the bodies that make it up? What is the reciprocal obligation if a man, or now a man and or a woman, says, I will possibly surrender my life, I will give my body to this country? What does the body politic owe it in return? And, you know, we live in a society which, thank God, has the luxury of turning away from the experience of death as much as it does. And we like to sort of chastise ourselves for that, but come on, this is not easy stuff. Fears of mortality shake us all, and as much release as we can get from that, the better. But at some point, we have to come back to that. And there is a profound sense that for most of the time human beings are on the face of the planet, we've known that an aspect, almost a precondition of living well, is understanding how to die well. So we can't push it entirely off the stage. We must understand it in proportion. And particularly when it comes to that category of person who dies in the military, who dies for the country, we have a very special relationship to those people. And as Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says in our film, you know, the Civil War set the foundation for this. When he goes to a gravesite, when he went to a gravesite with a grieving family member, he said, he holds them by the hand and he says, listen, we will never forget what they did. We will never forget the sacrifice they made, and by extension, you're making. This was your beloved sister, daughter, husband, wife, father, son. So I think that the meaning of the film is to understand that when war means death, and as it always does, we must understand what that really, really means where the rubber meets the road. And someone once challenged Drew when her book first came out and said, chastised her respectfully, saying, you know, by emphasizing death, wasn't she taking her eye away from the ennobling consequences? Of course, above all, emancipation, but also the preservation of the Republic. She was saying she was confused with it because she didn't feel she was wanting to ignore that at all, but rather, on the contrary. And I think this goes to the heart of what the meaning, I hope, of our film is, and I know of her book. We need to know when we wage war what war really is, so that we understand the circumstances under which it's worth taking those sacrifices. So we cannot hide the dead. We need to see the dead. We need to understand, not in a lurid way or a disrespectful way, but concretely. We need to have the bodies of our dead sons and daughters, as heartbreaking as that is, and be able to see and feel it and understand this is the cost of that war. And one of the remarkable things, and people like Drew Faust and David Blight and Mark Shantz and Vincent Brown and all the other wonderful historians in our film, the poet undertaker Thomas Lynch, the columnist George Will, you know, all in a funny way in concert were making the same point. You know, 2 days after the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, with hundreds, if not thousands of bodies still littering the battlefields outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, up comes a group of guys dressed in civilian clothes, carrying cumbersome equipment. They are guys from Matthew Brady's studio in New York City. And they're a private company. Nobody's invited them, but nobody has said, where are your papers? And they're walking across a field littered with dead bodies, Confederate and Union. And they're taking pictures, which 2 months later appeared at Matthew Brady's Daguerrean Gallery in Lower Manhattan, under the simple title, The Dead of Antietam. And that broke like a thundercloud over the civilian population in the North. You know, Antietam was the first time that the war was brought home to the North, if only barely, right across the Virginia border. And the next summer, it would really be brought home in south-central Pennsylvania, at Gettysburg. But for a civilian population, which unlike the South had no direct experience, these, as the New York Times put it, was like having dead bodies all but dragged up and laid on our doorstep or in our backyards. No one was shocked by it. People were stunned by it, but no one said this is disrespectful. No one said this is unpatriotic. People understood this is what war means. And I think that if we've come so far in our successful evasion of death in the 21st century, it's too shocking for us to grasp the consequences of our own military activities. That's the problem. We must understand this is what war means. We must understand that every one of those dead bodies was someone who wished not to die, who, if they were going to die, sorely would have wished to be with the mothers and sisters and wives that would comfort them, or now the husbands and brothers and sons. That crucial connection, which is in the heart of us, it's written into our DNA. We do not want to lose connection with those people who we love. And things like photographs, things like honest reporting that bring us back into contact, not lurid, not sensationalistic, but that say, here are our bodies. These are the bodies that sacrificed for us. Boy, I think we have a huge moral obligation to withstand the stress that puts us all under and say, right, I'm going to bow my head and pray to whatever God I pray to, or to none if I don't, but recognize that a larger corporate collective purpose has been served by these men and women who have fallen. That is a meaning which can never, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I think Drew would agree, that can never lose its relevance. It's what sort of defines us, first as human beings, second as members of a nation, in this case Americans. So I think that I know death in the Civil War doesn't sound like, you know, a picnic. And I suppose in certain ways it's not as a film experience. But I hope that somehow people feel to some degree as moved as we were in confronting this kind of material, because I think that truth can sometimes be very, very hard, but it is also clean and can be cleansing. And, you know, the hard granite of reality has the virtue of being hard and palpable and real. And I hope that people are not depressed by the film, but perhaps made reflective by it and think a little bit and think and feel, because I certainly know that was what Drew's wonderful book, wonderful, difficult book, made Mark Samuels feel, made all my colleagues and I feel, and what we were trying to kind of capture in that 2-hour film.
Well, Rick, it's a remarkably powerful film. Very fortunate I got a chance to look at it, and I want to thank you for making it. And I do hope that viewers can appreciate what the war meant to those 31 million people. And I think by watching this film, you can see that death was a very stark reality and something that could not be avoided, and something that defined more than a generation. And when you get towards talking about the government, you know, it can carry forward to this day. So again, the documentary is Death in the Civil War, How the Unthinkable Became Unforgettable. It premieres on Tuesday, September 18th, 8 Eastern on PBS. And I hope, Rick, that it's not another 20 years before we have another Civil War film from you. And I hope that we see something else again from you in the future. And thank you for taking some time with us today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for talking with me, Dave.